And the speak he's going to hold today is also about the global food production and the food industry. And the name is the same as the latest book he wrote, Global Eating Disorder. Welcome, Gunnar.
Thank you. Is it on?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much for the introduction. Well, I just jump into the topic. I saw we have guests also from the south of Sweden and the north of Sweden watching this on a video link, so hello to you too. Well, I'll start with a quote from an American author called Michael Pollan, who writes a lot about farming and food in particular, and also about gardening. And he wrote a book where he described his process for the good bread, for the high quality bread. And ultimately his conclusion was that in order to make the bread he really wanted, the bread of a really good quality, he just didn't need a better recipe. He needed a whole different civilization, because he showed how the wheat, the cultivation of wheat has changed the wheat, how the milling industry has changed the wheat flour we eat, and everything has changed. So you cannot separate food from the agriculture and from the total society where this food is produced. And I would say that is the entry point also for my speech and for my book, is to try to show, as far as I can, the linkages between food, agriculture, and our society at large. They are all reflections of the same, so to say. You cannot have, artisanal food culture and an industrial agriculture system, for instance. They are incompatible. You have to, if you choose one, you also have to make adjustments on the other ones. If we go back a few hundred years ago, it would have been a totally surrealistic idea that our preferences as consumers would direct food production. Today we are told that the consumer is king, the consumers decide what to eat and not to eat, and thereby farmers and the food industry adopt their behaviors to satisfy the demands of the consumers. However, one of my points is that this is also a very big myth. The early trade with food was very limited, and it was directed mainly by, I would say, ecological necessity. We imported, for instance, salt to Sweden. That was because we needed salt to preserve foodstuff like fish and meat and things like that, and maybe to cure skins as well. So that was driven by ecological necessity. In the same way, farmers in plains and farmers in mountain areas got a certain level of specialization, where farmers in mountain areas mainly raised cattle or sheep, but depending on climate, and farmers on the plain grew more grain, and these different populations swapped products with each other in one way or another, and that improved, I would say, ecological adaptation of human beings to different landscapes. It made it possible to live in places where we would otherwise not live. Today, however, trade and markets in food and agriculture products are not at all linked to any ecological necessity. It's linked to the need for profit. For instance, in Sweden, we import maybe half of the beef we eat. We import a very big share of the cheeses we eat. Why do we do that? Well, it's not because you cannot produce them in Sweden. You can perfectly produce both beef and cheese in Sweden. We all know that. We have actually abandoned 1 million hectares of farmland and more than 1 million hectares of grazing areas. Why do we do that? Well, it's because it doesn't pay to farm in Sweden. It's cheaper to import from somewhere else. And I don't think this is driven by consumer demand, but it's driven by other factors in the food industry, both in agriculture but also in the industry itself. If we look at the big picture, I'm not talking about this year's fashion. I'm talking about the longer trends that shape agriculture and the food we have. I kind of identify 4 main drivers in this system. One is the introduction of fossil fuels, both in the farming itself, with all the technologies attached, tractors, all the chemical fertilizers, but also fossil fuel for driving the marketplace, making transportation incredibly cheap, making it quite the place where you produce quite detached from the place where you consume. Another main driver is the population growth, but not only population growth, but also where the population is. I think year 2007 was the first time in history where the urban population surpassed the rural population. But we have for around 200 years have a strong trend of urbanization, and that also shapes farming a lot. Not the least because the urban areas are mainly where there are so-called markets, which links to the third driver. It's the emergence of a market economy and globalization. Well, many people seem to believe that markets were always there, but that's really not understanding what a market economy is. Of course, there have mostly been some kind of markets, but they did not at all dictate or direct what people did. They were surplus offloads and stuff like that. And with globalization, it means that the markets has been much wider and they're also more deeper. Markets today are encompassing most parts of our lives, including the whole food sector, from farming and the inputs for farming to how we eat and what we eat and with whom we eat are all determined in the marketplace. The fourth is more a soft factor. It's about how we human beings think about ourselves, how we see our role and how we look upon the world we live in, where I would say the consumption aspects of being a human being has been largely enlarged. And we have some kind of religion. I call it a religion of progress. We have a total faith, or our culture has a total faith, is that we will always improve, things will be better next year than it was the year before, despite the fact that we have no historical evidence for this being a linear process of progress for humanity. Well, so those are things in the background. I will talk more about some of them, in particular the market and to some extent about fossil fuels. But all these things, some people would like to say this is the determining factor. I don't think that's so pointful. I think they complement each other. So urbanization is driving markets, markets is driving urbanization, fossil fuel is driving everything, and our mentality change according to the society we live in, whether that's we change the society because our mind changed or it's the other way around. I think it's a bit, I don't even try to explain that because I think they are interconnected and they actually mutually reinforce each other. And that's when we get a very strong societal development. It's when all these factors are actually mutually reinforcing themselves. Well, I talked about the market. This is the grain trade, the futures market in Chicago. There they sell 10 times the global corn production is sold there in futures contracts. Of course, these people mostly don't see any corn because they sell it purely for speculation purposes. They don't really care. I interviewed a trader there and he said it was no advantage at all to know anything about the commodity you sold. That's just a diversion because that's not the point. You have to understand the market, not the crop, so to say. Anyway, this is just a picture of trying to show how incredibly important markets has become for how we farm and what we eat. And again, I want to repeat that this is actually quite recent development. If we go back 200 years, for instance, only 3% of the global population lived in cities. The rest were rural people. Most of them did not sell food products as a main source of income. They kept it for themselves. They gave it to the landlord as a form of tax, or to the government, or to the church, or they barter it with other people. The open market for agriculture was very limited, and it was almost always extremely regulated by the governments because they feared a free market situation. About 100 years ago, still, the majority of the food produced in farms were not sold. Only the most advanced, meaning the most commercialized farm economies, meaning United Kingdom, United States, and the Netherlands and Belgium, about 75% of the crop was sold. But in the rest of the world, this was still very much an exception that farmers oriented their production to the market. It did not mean that they did not sell. People in Sweden have been selling butter for maybe 200 years and linen clothes and stuff like that. But it was a marginal part of their production system, and it did not make the ultimate decisions for how to farm was not made in the marketplace, so to say. And this is a real big change. We can trace this back to some big global developments. This is sugar cane. Sugar was the first main global food crops. It developed from a very marginal luxury. It was known 3,000-4,000 years ago that you could make sugar and you had candy, etc. But the Europeans took it over from India or via the Arabs. Unfortunately, they also took over slavery and built up the whole sugar economy on slave labor. In addition, they produced a very cheap product that could be globally traded. The value of the sugar import for England, France, and Portugal in the 18th century was more than all other colonial imports together. So important was the sugar economy for the development of the modern, I would say, capitalist society. It was based on slavery. It also made sugar very cheap. And that's from that time we have the English tradition of drinking very, very sweet tea and bread as a fast food for the English working class who needed some quick energy for their work. The pattern of sugar plantation has then been repeated in various ways. One was when the North American prairie was converted into farmland. Another one is going on at this moment in Brazil, where parts of the Cerrado and the Amazonas is converted into pasture and even more soy plantations. Another example is the large-scale palm oil transformation of the rainforest of Indonesia and Malaysia. They all follow the same pattern, a very, I would say, brutal violation of both people and the landscape. It's more or less raping the landscape, and a large-scale conversion of agriculture of the landscape to an agriculture production machine to which nobody else can compete with. Because the enormous economy of scale that are established in these kind of farm operations is completely impossible for a cultural landscape as the Swedish one to even try to compete. We can be happy that we are not producing palm oil here. But we can see that our own vegetable oil production and our butter production certainly cannot compete with any palm oil. Paradoxically, these landscapes, which are so converted to just produce one agriculture commodity or maybe two in a very intensive way in monocultures, become very dead landscapes. The most productive agriculture landscapes in the world, like the American Midwest, is totally dead. If you drive there, there is no people left because you don't need any people in these highly mechanized operations. As a matter of fact, the American Midwest, where all this corn is produced, is declared, many municipalities are called food deserts there, meaning people have so far to get any food that they cannot get a good diet from what is available locally, because nobody eats anything from the farms any longer. So you have to shop, but you don't have any shops in an agricultural landscape which have so few people left. You can see the same in the Swedish landscape, by the way. The shops are just concentrating in the outskirts of Uppsala or other cities. So it's a paradox that the most productive agricultural landscapes are dead landscapes, not only environmentally, but also socially dead landscapes. Well, the development is not only an agriculture issue, it's also an industrial issue. Food industry has transformed both our food habits, but also agriculture a lot more than many people seem to realize. If we take wheat flour, for instance, until the mid-80s or late 1800s, mills were everywhere, and people produced flour locally from local grain. Sometimes it was barley, sometimes it was rye, sometimes it was wheat, depending on the local conditions. With the railroads, you could start to transport wheat longer distances, and that was the start of the death of the small mills. The other aspect, equally important, was the development of steel roller mills, which developed about 150 years ago in Budapest. They developed steel roller mills that had very high capacity. Not only had they a much higher capacity, they could make white flour, which the previous milling technology could not really make in a very efficient way. You could make white flour. It was extremely rare. It was a pure luxury product until 150 years ago. But with the new milling technology, you could make white flour on a large scale. And that has enormous implications for several reasons. Because not white flour, whole flour has very limited shelf life. It deteriorates very rapidly because what do you call the process? Well, anyway, oxidates in some way or another. So it doesn't store very well, which meant people had to mill frequently, buy small quantities of flour from the shop or mill themselves, etc. That still kept small mills and small bakeries alive. But with white flour is a commodity that can be stored if it's protected from insects, well, 1 year. Of course, it gets a bit worse, but basically it still tastes okay. So the combination of railroad and steamship transport of wheat and the ability to store white flour totally reformed not only how we eat bread, but the whole milling industry, the baking industry, etc. And these are technical developments that people don't understand fully. And it also kicks back to agriculture, because the milling industry didn't want the soft wheat. They wanted a hard wheat. So farmers changed what wheat they grew to satisfy the mills. And this is just one of hundreds of examples of how the industry is dictating what the farmers are growing, because the industry needs another quality for its production. So, and the absurd result sometimes is, for instance, in Indonesia, the most popular dish today is noodles, wheat noodles. The Indonesian population eats 14 billion packages of instant wheat noodles per year. But Indonesia does not produce a single kilogram of wheat, because it's a tropical country where you don't grow wheat. But this started when the Americans dumped wheat in the 60s as food aid to Indonesia. And from then on, the population took up wheat noodles as their favorite dish. And now we have a completely absurd thing where the biggest dish in the country is totally made from imported wheat from America or from Australia or any other of the big wheat-producing nations. Well, one of the components in this system is the energy which we load into the food system. Well, this graph is showing the energy used in the food system, where we have gradually moved energy use from agriculture more and more into the food chain. So today, agriculture actually represents a smaller quantity or proportion of the energy in the food chain. Nevertheless, agriculture is totally dependent on fossil fuels. It's the main component. Natural gas is the main component for making nitrogen fertilizers, for instance, which is together with diesel for machinery, two very important uses of energy in the food chain. The total food chain today in a country like United States or Sweden consumes something around between 10 and 15 times as much energy as it produces. Well, in the old times, when human labor and animal labor was the driver of agriculture, it's quite apparent that the agriculture system had to produce at least as much energy in the shape of food as it consumed. And that often it produced more, something like double, because there was an upper class and rulers and priests and others who took the profit from the farmers, so to say, and ate it themselves. So that's his story. Today, the food system is net energy deficient. Well, some people say, well, it doesn't matter. You can't compare oil and food. It's totally different. Well, they are different. But once you talk about producing bioenergy from field crops, well, you can't do that if you have an energy-deficient agriculture production system. That becomes quite apparent. You put in a lot of oil to produce something which doesn't give more energy in return than you put in. It's a non-starter. And unfortunately, that is also the case with some of the biofuel projects we hear about. Interestingly enough, with this is also this distribution of energy in the food chain is not only talking about energy, it's actually also quite a good representation where the money goes in the food chain today, meaning a smaller and smaller proportion of the money in the food chain goes to the farmers and a bigger and bigger proportion to wholesalers. Food service means restaurants or catering and stuff like that, and the food processing industry, which takes more. As a matter of fact, in the United States, the payment to farm workers and farmers for labor is a smaller cost than food advertising, if you look at where the money is spent in the food chain. So far has we been very successful, I would say, in making agriculture very efficient from the sole perspective of high productivity per labor unit, but it's not very productive from many other aspects. Well, of course, agricultures have a lot of challenges. I will not mention all of them. I assume that some of them are already well known. This picture is from the south of Sweden, where trucks and excavators are taking off the topsoil from one of the best soils in the world, I would say. Just outside Malmö for building another shopping center, of course, which we do also in this city. I think it's quite appalling to see how they build on the clay soils around Uppsala. So the topsoil we have is actually our biggest asset, I would say, in terms of humanity. The topsoil, the upper 20-centimeter layer, is what makes agriculture possible. It takes something like 50 to 500 years, they say, to build 1 centimeter of good topsoil. And we need 20 centimeters for a good farming system. It takes, well, just a few years, or in this case, just a day, to take away the whole topsoil. And once it's gone, it's very, very costly to renovate or to recapture. Many of the big, large-scale agriculture transformations, like the one in the North American prairie, have been partly successful because they just took the landscape and didn't care about the people living there. Everything was for free. But also because they took the organic matter in the soil, the humus in the soil, and actually eroded it. They say that the American prairie has lost about half of its organic matter, which is what makes topsoil. Without the organic matter, it's just dead minerals. So what people are doing actually is mining the soil from organic matter, which slowly will erode the soil until it's no good any longer. Another very important production factor is, of course, water. In Sweden, we are blessed, I would say, with water resources. We don't see water use in agriculture as a particular problem, so to say, unless maybe sometimes when we want to water our lawn, if we live somewhere and there is a municipal ban on watering, people get a bit frustrated. But by and large, water is a non-issue in this country when it comes to agriculture. But globally, it's a very big issue. And in many places, groundwater tables are going down with 1, 2, 3 meters per year. And they estimate that some 300 million people in the world are living on totally unsustainable extraction on groundwater. And many others are living on, I would say, unsustainable, but still not so rapidly unsustainable as the other ones. There are some examples, like Saudi Arabia started with large-scale irrigation. They are rich like hell. So they thought they could use all their money to do irrigation, to produce wheat and feed stuff for their animals. But now, 30 years later, they have abandoned almost all of it because there is no water. I mean, ultimately, it's better for them to pump oil and buy food than to use the money and try to dig deeper and deeper and deeper to get fossil water, because there is no recharging of the groundwater there because there is so little rainfall. So water is a very difficult issue, and increasingly we have a situation where we have a convergence, a nexus of land, water, energy, and food. They all in some way are interrelated. You can take food out of production and make biofuel out of it. You need energy in the shape of electricity or diesel to pump water, to irrigate crops, and to get more food by using energy. And you know, the interactions are very strong. In China, for instance, 2011, there was a big drought, and the Chinese government decided to take water from the Three Gorges Dam, this enormous dam they built, which has 2 purposes. One is for irrigation, and one is for energy production. And at every single moment, you actually can choose whether you want to use the water for irrigation or for energy production. It's the same resource. Well, anyway, 2011, they decided that they could not use it any longer for energy production. They took water corresponding to 2 million Olympic-sized swimming pools and diverted it to irrigation instead of energy production. It increased China's consumption of oil with 300,000 barrels just to make that decision. So we have a very clear competition between food production and energy production. Energy production is also, next to agriculture, the second biggest use of water in the world. You need energy for cooling the nuclear power plants or fossil fuel plants, etc., etc. So you need water for producing energy, but you also need, as I said, energy to produce food. In California, 20% of the electricity used is for pumping water. And that in a place where they have all this air conditioning and everything else that is very energy consuming. So we have to, this is a real challenge for the future. Who will win, so to say? And we have these huge inequalities in the world. Who will take command over these resources? We see increasingly that both land and water is privatized all over the world. Historically, they were not privatized at all. Land has not been owned in most countries in the world since very recently. Okay, another very big concern, I would say, is, of course, all other environmental effects of the current agriculture system. This is just one. It's showing nitrogen. This is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, showing the increase of active nitrogen in the biosphere in some 100 years, and it has increased like 7 times, almost all of it as a result of the increase of chemical nitrogen fertilizers. What this means is that we are overcharging the whole biosphere with more and more nitrogen. It comes out everywhere. It comes out in the rivers, in the sea, in the forest. It's growing 20-30% better than before just because of nitrogen downfall. It's the same with carbon dioxide. It looks very nice to begin with because it actually increases growth everywhere. Everybody's getting more. Shouldn't we be happy? But I would say this is a very dangerous situation because we have no clue with these big global cycles what happens at a certain time when they are overcharged. As we saw with climate change, most people had no clue that that was a problem. Well, why is that a problem? It's good for the plants with more carbon dioxide. Well, now people see it's a problem. Actually, there is something called the European Nitrogen Assessment, which was a big scientific study on nitrogen, and their conclusion was that the return of €1 or krona invested in nitrogen fertilizers will normally be between 2 and 5 euros for the farmer, meaning, you invest 1, you get 5 back. It's a good deal. But if you include the cost for society, the cost for society was estimated to be equally or bigger than the benefit for the farmer of using these nitrogen fertilizers. The thing is, though, that the cost for society for farmers using nitrogen fertilizers is not included in the price of food when you buy it. It's instead included in the taxes you pay, or even worse, it's not included anywhere because we just let the thing continue, so it will be paid by future generations instead that has to clean up the mess we have created. I take this as just one example. We can talk about pesticides and other aspects of the farming system, which I will not do now. I think you are probably quite aware of it. I would also like to talk about one more aspect of farming is that, farmland in a very strict sense occupies about 1/3 of the terrestrial area of the planet. But if we look at it from a more landscape perspective and realize that also the swamps and the small forest areas and the ditches and stuff which are within the farm landscapes are part of the farming agriculture system or the ecological system or the biome, we will see that the farm landscapes, the croplands and the rangelands are 50% of the total area. And if we include villages, we're almost up to 60%. And equally, about 60% or 55% of the biological primary productivity is taking place within landscapes that are totally dominated by human farming activities, whether they are pastures or fields. This also means that we cannot talk about biodiversity on a global scale without talking about farming. Of course, we have rainforests, we have other deserts and places which need to be protected and where biodiversity is also very important. But today, most of the biodiversity we need to maintain is within our own landscape, the man-made landscapes. Wild nature hardly exists any longer. Well, I don't want to talk about the forest, which is another topic, of course. So we have to see management of the farming system also as management of the total planet, I would say. We have the fate of thousands, hundreds of thousands of species in our hand by how we farm is determining whether they will survive or not survive. And of course, these aspects are also not included in the price of food, or the cost of food. We do know that farmers today, to some extent, get payment for environmental protection, etc., etc. But we also can see that this is largely taken up by farmers who in any way were quite close to it, and the big, so to say, large-scale farming system is going on with not too much uptake of these kind of payments. Well, I'll come back to the driver of the system. One of the big drivers, that's the trade and the market. This ship is the world's biggest container ship, the Maersk McKinney Møller. It can take 18,000 containers. That corresponds to, if you would transport Coca-Cola, it would correspond to 1 billion cans of Coca-Cola in one single ship. It's manned by only 20 people. So the cost of production per unit is very, very low. And this is why you would basically say that farmers everywhere are competing with each other. And we need to understand the implications of this, of which we see the effects already today, but we will see even more in the future. And I will talk about it from two very different perspectives. One is the smallholders in, say, Africa. This is Susan Makandavire in Zambia, farming together with her husband Fred in the outskirts of close to the international airport in Zambia. She and her husband grows maize. She does most of the growing because the husband is trying to get some odd jobs. He does some charcoaling. He works as a security guard to get some cash income, while she is taking the responsibility for growing the maize for the family. They even use chemical fertilizers, which is subsidized by the government. They even use modern seeds. And still she doesn't harvest more than 900 kilograms of maize per year from her acre, which is less than half a hectare. That's enough for her and her family to survive, but it does not generate any surplus of any kind. Instead, the husband has to go away to earn some money to pay for clothes, for school fees, for medicine, and even for the tool that they need to replace now and then. Well, and it's not surprising that Susan says, I don't want my children to become farmers. I think farmers have been saying that for centuries in many countries. Well, this guy is quite a different person. His name is Bob Stewart in Illinois, the Corn Belt in the United States. He runs a family farm. It's still called a family farm. He was born on the farm. He runs it with his brother and some 5 or 6 people helping him. He farms 3,200 hectares. Most of the farm is under maize or corn. He also grows some soya. But both crops are genetically modified, Roundup resistant, which allows him to grow them in monoculture and spray Roundup, glyphosate every year. He harvests something like 10 tons of maize per hectare, which is about 5 times, or a little more than 5 times as much as Susan. But the big difference is not the yield per area unit. There are also many smallholders that can harvest, maybe not 10, but I've met smallholders who harvest 7 tons per hectare with rather simple mechanical methods or manual methods. The big difference is that each worker in his farm can manage about 400 to 500 hectares of farmland. That's the big difference. The labor productivity is something like 400 times as big. The area productivity is, 3, 4, 5 times as big. It's not at all as important. People in the agriculture sector are so focused on this yield per hectare as being so important for farmers. But honestly, it's not. It's the cost that is important. And the productivity per labor force is so much more important for how farming is developing. These guys, each of his workers, has energy corresponding to 1,000 barrels of oil. 1,000 oil barrels, these steel oil barrels. Although what we call an oil barrel isn't one. The real oil barrel is 156 liters and not the 200 liters we call oil barrels. Anyway, each worker has 1,000 oil barrels to use for fertilizers, diesel, all this kind of stuff. That corresponds to 14,000 labor years. You get me? 1 barrel of oil is 14 man years of labor, or women years, if you take Susan. The energy in the muscle of people. So it's not very surprising that these people can produce so much more and that they can produce it so cheaply, which is the big problem. The economic theories talk about comparative advantage, that poor farmers in poor countries like Susan, that they can compete with low labor cost. Well, that is still the fact if you have very manually intensive crops like horticulture crops, maybe some flowers and stuff like that. But when you talk staple food, the stuff that is still feeding the world, corn, wheat, rice, all these crops that make up 75% of the calories people eat, for them, low labor cost is a not very relevant competitive advantage any longer. It really doesn't matter. We made calculations on Susan's work. Even if she worked for zero, she could not produce. Her production costs are still higher than the large-scale farmers. So farming has gone from being very labor-intensive to be very capital-intensive. Most people still don't get that. Farming in Sweden is the second most capital-intensive business next to mining. You know, forget car industry and these things. That's peanuts. One job in the car industry. There's nothing compared to one job in farming. That is really an awful lot of capital. And capital is the limiting factors for farmers to produce more. It's the ability to invest. And the small holders are poor, which by definition mean they have no capital. They have no way to compete themselves out of this dilemma they are in. Well, even for rich farmers in rich countries, this is very difficult. Well, I guess most of you are Swedish speaking anyway. You can stand a Swedish picture. It's about the milk crisis in Sweden, which is very much on the agenda now, because milk prices are historically low and farmers are really desperately trying to make ends meet. But if you look a bit more carefully into the milk sector, what are the facts of the milk sector? Well, it's only 6% of the milk in the world which is globally traded. I have to tie my shoelace. Sorry. It wouldn't be good if I tripped. So 94% of all milk in the world is consumed in the same country as where it is produced. It's only 6% that is globally traded. Of these 6%, 1/3 comes from one single country. You know which one? New Zealand. Yeah. So New Zealand, which has only a few million inhabitants, actually produce 1/3 of the global world market for milk, mostly in the form of milk powder. One container of milk or milk products is leaving New Zealand, I had a figure somewhere, every 3rd minute, one container is exported from New Zealand. The prices in New Zealand is basically the world market price. And it's one company in New Zealand that controls the whole New Zealand production. It's actually Farmers Cooperative. So the beauty is that the Farmers Cooperatives in New Zealand that produce less than 2% of the global production of milk actually controls the world market price. And when they can produce milk cheaply, well, sorry, Swedish milk farmers are in a very bad shape. And for ages, people have had this idea, okay, we rationalize more, we invest more, we build milk robots, we become more efficient and more efficient. Well, it works, but only to some limit. You know, the Dutch greenhouse industry, it's really very super intensive. They invest like crazy. They all have, one greenhouse compound is bigger than all Swedish greenhouses together. They have invested like hell. For years, they have been very successful, but half of the greenhouses in Holland have not paid any interest rate or paid off their mortgages for more than 3 years. They are basically under custody of the banks because they make no money at all, and Swedish farmers can't compete with them. In the same way, the Danish export wonder, they are really successful in exporting dairy product, pig meat, and all this kind of stuff. But the farmers have a debt that is incredible. The average farm is owed the bank more than 10 million Swedish krona. And the big guys who are really driving the export, they are far much more indebted. So even for the better ones off, this whole global food system is really not a very good idea. Okay, so what's about food then? Well, this whole system has driven the food habits of people quite a lot, which has resulted. We have a perverse world where on one hand we still have 850 million people who go hungry to bed every day because they cannot eat enough. And we have 1.4 billion people that actually eat too much food. And often also very bad food. And this is a result of the food agriculture and food industry development where sugar cane, sugar, palm oil, soy oil, wheat, and, well, something more that I've forgotten. Corn, of course, are driving all the food production system. If you go into a shop, you will see how important these products are. They may not be sold as made of all this stuff, but if you read the table of ingredients, you will see how important they are in the food system. Still today, our food system is based on very few staple crops. As I said before, 3/4 of the calories come from a very, very limited number of crops. And what is even worse is that those limited number of crops are in a very narrow range, meaning for each, rice was 100,000 varieties before. Today, 3/4 of the rice crop in most countries is from 1 or 2 varieties. So we have a very narrow basis for our whole food system. And why do people eat more chicken? Why do you eat chicken? Why do people eat more chicken? It's cheap. Very good answer. If you would have said it's good, I wouldn't believe you. So why is chicken cheap? Well, this is a graph of global. It's not Swedish. It's a bit different in different countries. This is we hear about the big increase in meat consumption. Well, look at beef. It's basically more or less constant over a 50-year period. Pig is increasing and chicken is skyrocketing. And in Sweden, it increased 10 times since I was born. And that was a long time ago, of course. So why is this? Well, it's a chain of things. The first step, I would say, is the mechanization and introduction of chemical fertilizers in farming. That made it possible. So mechanizations mean no horses, no longer in the farm, no need for grazing of the horses. Chemical fertilizers meant, well, no need for crop rotations any longer, no need for mixed farming any longer. We can specialize in growing only grain. Well, what is a chicken? It's basically transformation of grain and soya into meat. That's the recipe for making modern chicken. The old-time chicken was an ecological niche expert that took care of things in the environment which we could not use. The modern chicken is completely fed with a large flow of soya, protein, and maize, mainly. In addition, the industrialization of the chicken feeding itself is another strong driver. They realized they could lock up chicken. They gave them vitamins because they were not allowed to go out. And they changed the chicken itself. Today we have layer chickens and meat chicken, broiler chickens. They're totally different breeds. The laying hen does not produce much meat, and the broiler hen doesn't produce a lot of eggs. And that's through genetics over a period of 60 years. Before they were the same. And when I was a child, chicken was very expensive. You could get the old hens, which were spent and didn't produce any longer. My mother made soup from them or stew, and that was cheap food. But the chicken was very expensive. Today, the broilers are producing a very, very, very cheap food. And the male chicken from the layers, the ones destined for making eggs, well, the males don't make any eggs. I think you know that. So what happens with them? Well, they are ground up alive. 300 million chicken every year in the European Union are just thrown into some kind of mill that eats them up in a very unpleasant way. That's what we do, and that's a result, again, of the industrialization of the food industry. Well, and the food industry's lines, the field lines, the empty lines of the field, the monocultures, are actually reflected in the shops, where I said before, well, when you go into the shop, you might think, well, there is 20,000 products. They say there are 20,000 food products in a well-assorted supermarket. What a variety. How many choices we can make. But if you really go in and look into those products, you will see that most of them are made up of the same main cheap commodities, flavored with, colors, laced with colors, preservatives, flavors of different kinds. So that's an enormous, I would say, equalization of the food culture in the world. Another thing is also on the farmer input side, that very few companies are controlling everything. So we are getting more and more narrow. If you look at I talked about chicken. Almost all broiler chicken in the world are from 3 species. 2 breeders control 94% of the chicken layers market. And the 3 biggest seed companies have 50% of the global seed market, of which Monsanto has 1/4 of the total market. The same in the food industry and the supermarkets. Well, ICA has 50% of the Swedish food share. And who would try to fool me that the consumers are ruling this system? They don't. Well, this is the microwave. There is a food historian called Felipe Fernandez Armesto. He says that the microwave reversed the cooking revolution, which made eating sociable, and returns us, in this respect, to a pre-social phase of evolution. He meant that sharing a meal has, until the microwave being, a very important social glue. And with the microwave, we actually have the opportunity to have a completely individualistic eating pattern. We can eat when we like, what we like, completely detached from any other social relationships, which has its beauty. But it also meant that we lost the social opportunity to use the meal. And it's, of course, not a coincidence that this pattern also fits the food industry perfectly well to supply us with ready-made dishes to put into the microwave compared to the more tedious work of cooking. I'm a bit short of time, so I skipped the discussion about enough food. We can take it later. So I want to move to where I want to move, meaning what kind of changes would I like to see and what I think are needed in the food system. Well, I think we need some kind of transformation from the conventional food system, which is built on linear flows, high energy input, competition, commercialization, externalization of cost, meaning let somebody else pay the bill, and industrialization of all the parts of the chain, and then backed up with marketing and advertising to make us eat what is the food industry produce. We need to move from there to some kind of system where we regenerate resources in the farming system, but also in the householders. We regenerate land, biodiversity, inputs. We regenerate fertility on the soil instead of buying it in bags. We regenerate the labor on the farm, meaning people like to stay and work there. We regenerate meaning of food and farming. It has to be based on cooperation and some kind of co-production. We need to integrate food, farming, people, landscape, and culture into one whole. And it needs to be based on communication and dialogue instead of advertising and marketing. So we need transformations in many ways. We need a transformation of our view as food as a commodity, as something that is primarily bought and sold, as to food as a right, as part of being a human being. It's actually already recognized as a universal right by the United Nations, but it doesn't seem to mean much when 850 people are hungry. We have to think about food as being not only nutrient intake and something to consume, that we have eating as part of our culture. If you read the dietary recommendations from Brazil, they are marvelous to read next to the Swedish one. The Brazilian official recommendations for diet is that you should eat together with people, blah, 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 enjoy the food and things like that. The Swedish one is you should eat so and so many calories and so many grams of this and that. It's a totally nutritionist approach to what we eat. And I think we need to have a bit more joy into the food. We also need to think about nature away from being private property, whether we talk about land or water or bio-ecosystem services, as commons, as communal public goods that we need to take care of together. And we need to go away from farming as a business to farming as some kind of planetary stewardship. For some decades now, farmers have been ashamed of being farmers as a lifestyle choice, and their organization, LRF and others, have told farmers, well, you should not. You should be entrepreneurs. You should be proud entrepreneur. Leave this lifestyle blaha on the side because it's old-fashioned, it's stupid, it's dumb. But it's the entrepreneur way that means we have a milk crisis in Sweden. It's a total competition that means just a few will survive and the others will die. Is that a future? I don't think so. So how do we create a virtuous cycle that will lead us there? I don't have all the answers. There are many, many initiatives going on today. I visited one in Freiburg, which is a smaller town, a bit bigger than, smaller than Uppsala in Germany. They have started something they call the Regionalwert AG, meaning they're a regional worth limited company, where citizens of Freiburg, not citizens, not consumers. Citizens of Freiburg invest money in farming and food production for things that they think are good, to increase the diversity of the landscape and the good food produced. So they have together collected 2.2 million euro. They invested in 15 different operations, 1 winery, 2 vegetable box schemes, catering company, wholesalers, cheese farm, fruit farms, and 2 shops. All of this is actually to shield these farmers a bit from the forces of the market. It's not a revolutionary scheme. These people are not necessarily buying the products. It's not some utopia. It's just to shield them because they realize, like so many else, that the market forces are driving farmers to a place where they don't want to be. And I felt it myself. I farmed for 32 years, so I know how the market forces are working on you when you farm. Another version is what is in English called community-supported agriculture. It exists also in Sweden. There is a farm north of Uppsala that has been doing this for many years called Ramsjögård. This one is from China. I don't know if the donkey is happy. It's called the Little Donkey Farm. They have 400 families that are subscribing to food from this farm, and they participate in the planning of the farm. They do some work and things like that. In addition, a few hundred households are also farming on the farm, meaning they have their farm lots and farm together with the farmer to produce their own food. It's another example of people trying to find other ways to re-engage with farming and food, I would say, because the food is a very important part of this, to again try to find ways which are, I'm not saying objecting the market, but are rounding the market and making things different. Well, a farming system that should work in such a society, well, I've been working with organic, as you heard, for many, many years, and I still think it's perfectly possible to run the whole global system on something like organic. It doesn't mean it has to fulfill all the detailed rules of the CRAV or the EU regulation or organic, which is 200 pages, of which some of it may be nonsense, honestly. It's not the point, so to say. It's the organic approach to farming I'm talking about, not the nitty-gritty details. We always have to be a bit flexible and adjust ourselves to where we are and to where things are. It's again a farming system where we integrate plants, crops, people. Not forget people, because we cannot make farming sustainable without people. It's people that makes it sustainable. And ultimately, this also means interacting, re-engaging with food in a nice way. I mean, the problem today, there is an enormous food interest in Sweden today. They sell one new title of cookbook every day. But cooking is going somewhere where hunting has gone, and fishing and gardening. It becomes an exclusive hobby. So it's still something tedious you really don't want to do for your living or as a daily thing, but you do all this fancy thing in the weekend, and then you buy takeaway food or whatever in the weekdays because it's tedious work. And I think we have to, in some way, re-engage with food and see it as part of life and not as something, a burden, so to say. Although I have all respect for especially women that over the centuries have seen it as a burden because they had no other choice. I think we need to share not the burden of making food, but the joy of making food and the joy of eating food together. Thank you.